Dr. Zexai had spent 3 decades studying the galaxy's most feared predator species, the Vorthak with their razor claws, the Grim Hunters with their acidic saliva, the Shadow Stalkers who could phase through solid matter, yet none of them had prepared him for the moment he first encountered humanity's wrath. The research station orbiting Kepler 442b hummed with quiet efficiency as Zexai reviewed the latest data streams from Earth's recent conflict with the Hegemony Coalition. His 4 eyes moved independently across multiple holographic displays, each showing different aspects of human military engagement. The battles had been swift, decisive, and absolutely terrifying to witness. Computer, replay engagement sequence 447 Alpha, Zexai commanded in his native tongue, his translator converting the clicks and whistles into standard galactic common. The hologram flickered to life, showing a human fleet of merely 12 vessels facing off against a hegemony armada of over 200 ships. The size difference was laughable. The hegemony had brought enough firepower to glass 3 planets, while the humans appeared to have arrived with what could charitably be called a patrol group. Zexai had initially assumed this would be a massacre worthy of study only for its brevity. The hegemony forces opened fire first, their plasma cannons turning space into a light show of destruction. But then something extraordinary happened. The human ships didn't scatter or attempt to flee. Instead, they moved with a coordination that seemed almost telepathic. The first human vessel, a sleek destroyer called the Retribution, dove directly into the center of the enemy formation. Its weapons weren't the largest Zexai had seen, but they fired with a precision that defied explanation. Each shot found its mark with surgical accuracy, targeting not the heavily armored hulls of enemy ships but specific systems: shield generators, weapon arrays, engine clusters. Within minutes, the hegemony's numerical advantage began to crumble. Ships found themselves dead in space, weapons offline, shields collapsed. But the humans weren't destroying them, not yet. They were systematically dismantling the fleet's ability to fight back, like a predator toying with wounded prey. Zexai's research assistant, a young Veltari named Kess, entered the observation chamber carrying a steaming cup of the bitter brew that kept Zexai alert during long research sessions. "Professor, the preliminary reports from the ground engagement on Kepler 442b have arrived." "Ah, excellent timing," Zexai replied, accepting the drink gratefully. "What did our sensors detect?" Kess activated her personal datapad, her tentacles dancing across the surface with practiced ease. The human forces landed with approximately 5,000 troops. They faced a hegemony garrison of 30,000, including mechanized armor divisions and air support. And the outcome? Total human victory within 18 hours. Hegemony casualties: 0 dead, approximately 15,000 wounded requiring medical attention. Human casualties: 3 injured, none fatal. Zexai nearly dropped his cup. "That's impossible." "Run those numbers again." "I've verified them 3 times, Professor. The humans somehow managed to defeat a force 6 times their size while inflicting 0 fatalities. Our long-range sensors detected the use of non-lethal weapons almost exclusively. Stun rounds, electromagnetic pulse devices, some kind of gas that induced temporary paralysis." The old xenobiologist leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This contradicted everything he thought he knew about human warfare. The galaxy's databases were filled with stories of human fury, their legendary berserker rage that could drive them to fight impossible odds. He'd studied the Battle of Thermopylae, the Last Stand at the Alamo, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Humans were supposed to be creatures of passion and violence when cornered. "Computer, cross-reference this engagement data with previous human military actions over the past 50 years, Zexai commanded. The holographic displays shifted, showing battle after battle, conflict after conflict. As the data compiled, a disturbing pattern emerged. In every single engagement where humans held a significant tactical advantage, their casualty rates among enemy forces dropped dramatically. It was as if their capacity for mercy increased proportionally with their ability to inflict damage. "This makes no sense," Zexai muttered, his 4 eyes narrowing to focus on a particularly puzzling data point. During the siege of Proxima Station, human forces had the opportunity to destroy a raider fleet that had been terrorizing civilian shipping lanes for months. Instead, they had disabled every ship, captured the crews alive, and even provided medical aid to wounded prisoners. Kess moved closer to examine the displays. "Professor, what if we've been approaching this wrong? What if human fury isn't their most dangerous trait? What do you mean? Look at this pattern. The angrier humans become, the more methodical they get. They don't lose control, they gain it. Their fury makes them more precise, not more reckless. They calculate exactly how much force is needed to achieve their objectives, and they never use more than necessary. HFY felt a chill run through his exoskeleton. He'd spent his entire career studying predators, and he recognized efficiency when he saw it. But this was something else entirely. This was the behavior of a species that had evolved beyond simple predation into something far more sophisticated. Computer, display human medical intervention statistics during military operations. The new data was even more unsettling. Human forces routinely carried medical supplies sufficient to treat not only their own wounded, but enemy casualties as well. They had developed non-lethal weapons that could incapacitate entire armies without permanent harm. Their interrogation techniques were so refined that they could extract information without causing psychological damage. "They're not just warriors," HFY whispered. "They're gardeners." Gardeners? Think about it. A gardener doesn't destroy the plants that grow in the wrong place. They carefully transplant them. They prune branches that grow too wild. They nurture the soil so that everything can grow properly. HFY stood up, pacing around the observation chamber. Humans don't wage war to destroy their enemies. They wage war to reshape the galaxy according to their vision of how things should be. The implications were staggering. Every military theorist in the galaxy had focused on human aggression. Their famous battle cry of "Remember the Alamo," and their tendency to fight to the last soldier. But what if that was missing the point entirely? What if human mercy was actually a sign of their supreme confidence in their own power? A species that could afford to be merciful to its enemies was a species that never truly felt threatened by them. Commander Jackson Davis stood on the bridge of the newly commissioned warship Defiance, watching Earth shrink in the rear displays. Around him, a crew of 200 worked at their stations with the intensity of people who knew their training period had been measured in weeks instead of years. Every one of them was a volunteer. Every one of them knew they were flying into a battle they were not supposed to win. The Defiance was not elegant like the sleek vessels of the Galactic Council. It was a crude thing, assembled in orbit using every shortcut and innovation humanity could devise. Parts of it were still unpainted, revealing the patchwork of metals scavenged from decommissioned satellites, old space stations, and even repurposed ocean vessels that had been cut apart and launched into space. It looked like something built in a scrapyard, because that was essentially what it was. But it flew, and more importantly, it carried weapons. Davis checked the tactical display. 40 more ships like the Defiance were taking position around Earth's orbital space. They formed a defensive sphere, one that military analysts had already calculated would last approximately 8 hours against a full swarm assault. 8 hours was not much, but it was 8 hours more than surrendering would have bought them. "Commander, we're receiving a transmission from Council Station," Lieutenant Park announced from communications. "It's Ambassador Keyleth. He's requesting a private channel." Davis considered ignoring it. The Council had made their position clear. They would observe but not intervene.
Humanity's fight was humanity's problem.
But curiosity won out over pride. "Put him through, audio only." The alien ambassador's voice came through with the artificial smoothness of a translator. "Commander Davis, I hope I am not interrupting your preparations." "We're pretty busy preparing to die if that's what you're asking," Davis replied without malice. It was simply fact. There was a pause. "I have been monitoring your species since the Council's decision. I confess I expected panic. But what I see instead is coordination on a scale that defies my understanding. Your entire planet has mobilized." Davis allowed himself a thin smile. When you're all in the same boat and the boat is sinking, people tend to forget their differences real quick. Funny how facing extinction makes political borders seem kind of stupid. "I have seen species unify before death," Keyleth said slowly, "but not like this. Your people are not building evacuation ships. They are building weapons. Weapons that violate treaties your government signed only months ago." "We're not part of the Galactic Council anymore," Davis said. "Hard to be a member when you're scheduled for extinction. As for the treaties, we signed them when we thought we had a future. Things change." Through the viewport, Davis could see the construction crews working on one of the massive platforms. They were building what the engineers called kinetic bombardment stations, massive railguns that could accelerate projectiles to a significant fraction of light speed. The math said they would work once, maybe twice, before the swarm adapted. But once or twice might be enough to make a difference. I am not calling to lecture you on treaties, Calith said, his tone shifting. I am calling because I accessed restricted council files. I wanted to understand what you face. Let me guess, it's worse than they told us, yes and no, the ambassador replied. The swarm is exactly as deadly as the council claimed. But I found something interesting in the historical records. Every species that faced the swarm did so with advanced warning. They had years, sometimes decades, to prepare, and in every case they spent that time evacuating, not fighting. Davis felt something cold settle in his stomach. What are you saying? I am saying that I cannot find a single instance of a species choosing to fight the swarm the way you are preparing to fight. The mathematics always convinced them it was futile. Maybe they were smarter than us. Or maybe, Keyleth said quietly, they were not desperate enough. A species that accepts death does not fight with the creativity of one clinging to life. The transmission ended, leaving Davis alone with his thoughts. Around him, the crew continued their work. Young men and women, most of them barely out of training, preparing for a battle that every expert said they would lose. But they were here anyway, manning their stations, checking their weapons, running drills that had been invented just weeks ago. His second in command, Commander Sarah Okonkwo, approached from the tactical station. She had been a naval officer before the crisis, one of the best strategic minds in the fleet. Now she was helping devise ways to fight an enemy that had never been fought before. The weapon is ready for testing, she said. Are you sure you want to do this? If it works, we're showing our hand before the battle even starts. Davis nodded. If it works, the council needs to see it. Maybe it'll convince someone to help. And if it doesn't work, better we know now so we can try something else. The weapon in question was called Project Prometheus, and it was either brilliant or completely insane. Possibly both. The concept was simple, even if the execution was not. The swarm consumed technology, using advanced matter conversion to break down ships and stations into raw materials. It treated energy weapons as food, absorbing and redirecting beam attacks. Every conventional approach fed the enemy, so humanity decided to use the most unconventional approach possible. Fire when ready, Davis ordered. On the tactical display, a small drone separated from the Defiance and accelerated toward an empty region of space. When it reached the designated coordinates, it detonated. But this was not a normal explosion. What emerged from the blast was something that made the crew go silent. A cloud of metallic dust spread through space, each particle no larger than a grain of sand. Individually, they were harmless, but there were trillions of them, and each one was coated with a substance that human scientists had spent 3 weeks perfecting. It was a chemical compound based on proteins found in Earth's most aggressive bacteria, modified and enhanced until it became something new, something hungry. The particles began to drift, expanding into a sphere several kilometers wide. On the monitors, sensors showed them behaving almost like living things, clustering together and breaking apart in patterns. That seemed random, but were actually following programmed instructions, encoded in their molecular structure. Introducing test subject, Lieutenant Park announced, a small piece of swarm tissue, captured from a previous attack on another world and acquired through channels Davis preferred not to think about, was released into the cloud. The crew watched their displays with held breath. The particles swarmed the tissue like piranha on meat. Within seconds, the swarm sample began to break down, not from conventional weapons, but from a molecular assault it could not adapt to fast enough. The particles were too simple to be technology in the traditional sense, too complex to be mere chemistry. They occupied a strange middle ground that the swarm's conversion processes seemed unable to handle. It's working, someone whispered. But then the sample did something unexpected. It began to pulse, and the particles nearest to it suddenly stopped functioning, falling inert. The swarm was learning, adapting even in death. Adaptation time approximately 43 seconds, Okonkwo reported. But for those 43 seconds it was being destroyed. Davis felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in weeks. Not hope exactly, but possibility. 43 seconds was not much, but multiply that across billions of particles, across multiple attack vectors, across defenses the swarm had never encountered before, and maybe, just maybe, those seconds would add up to something. Send the data to all fleet vessels, he ordered, and transmit a copy to Council Station. Let them see what happens when humanity gets creative. As the Defiance continued its patrol, Davis looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there the swarm was coming, an unstoppable force that had ended civilizations. But standing on the bridge of his impossible ship, surrounded by a crew that had no business being as competent as they were, he found himself thinking about Ambassador Chen's words. Humanity survives. It's what we do. The question was not whether they could win. The question was how much they could hurt the enemy before they fell, and whether that would be enough to matter. In the end, that might be the most human thing of all, refusing to go quietly, fighting until the last moment, and making sure that even in death, they would be remembered. The swarm was coming and humanity was ready. Not ready to win, perhaps, but ready to make losing as expensive as possible. The detection arrays screamed their warnings 3 days earlier than expected. Dr. Elena Martinez stared at the readings in the Deep Space Monitoring Station, her coffee forgotten in her hand, watching as reality rewrote itself at the edge of the solar system. The swarm did not arrive like ships in the movies, dropping out of hyperspace with dramatic flair. Instead, it came like a disease. Reality itself, seeming to corrupt and tear as something vast beyond comprehension, forced its way into normal space. The sensors could not agree on what they were seeing. Mass readings fluctuated wildly. Energy signatures spiked and vanished. The only consistent data was the direction. Toward Earth, toward humanity, toward extinction. "Get me a visual," Martinez ordered, though her hands were already shaking. The main screen flickered to life, and for a moment, everyone in the monitoring station went silent. The swarm was not a fleet or an armada or anything that had a name in human language. It was a living nightmare made manifest. A cloud of organic and technological matter so vast that it blotted out the stars behind it. Shapes writhed within the mass, things that might have been ships or might have been creatures. The distinction meaningless when dealing with an entity that consumed and incorporated everything it touched. Estimated arrival at Earth orbit, the tactical computer announced in its calm, inhuman voice. 72 hours. Martinez activated the emergency broadcast. "All stations, this is Deep Space Monitor 7. The swarm has arrived. I repeat, the swarm has arrived. Time to contact, 3 days." Across human space, from Earth to the lunar colonies to the scattered stations throughout the solar system, the message spread. Not panic, though fear was certainly present, but rather a grim acceptance. The wait was over. The fight would begin. On Earth, Ambassador Chen stood in the war room beneath Geneva, watching the holographic display as it updated with each new sensor reading. Around her, the leaders of every remaining nation gathered in person or by projection. The time for politics had passed. Now there was only survival. "They're early," said General Kumar, the head of the combined military forces. "Does that change our strategy?" Chen shook her head. "We always knew the timeline was an estimate. Our preparations are as complete as they're going to get. We fight now or we fight in 3 days. The outcome is the same." "Then we should begin the evacuation," someone suggested. "The colony ships are ready. We could save less than 1 million people," Chen interrupted. "Out of 8 billion. No. The colony ships stay grounded until we know whether our defense can buy them time to escape. If we launch them now and the swarm catches them in open space, everyone aboard dies. At least on Earth we have fortifications." The room fell silent. The mathematics were brutal, but they were also clear. The colony ships were slow and vulnerable. They needed time and distance to escape, and the only way to buy that was to make the swarm stop and fight for Earth instead of simply sweeping past it. In orbit, Commander Davis received the same alert aboard the Defiance. His fleet of 41 warships, humanity's entire space navy assembled in less than 7 weeks, began moving into defensive positions. They looked like toys compared to the approaching horror, but they moved with purpose and precision. "All ships, this is Defiance Actual," Davis broadcast on the fleet channel. "The swarm has arrived ahead of schedule. That means they're hungry, which means they're aggressive, which means they're going to make mistakes. Our job is to exploit every mistake they make. Remember your training. Remember what we're fighting for. And remember that even if we lose today, we're going to hurt them so badly they'll remember humanity for 1,000 years." The responses came back from 40 ships, crews ranging in age from 18 to 70, volunteers all. Not cheerful or optimistic responses, but determined ones. They knew what they faced. They were here anyway. The waiting was the worst part. 3 days watching that impossible mass crawl toward them across space, growing larger with each hour, sensors picking up more details that only made the situation look worse. The swarm was not just one thing but thousands of things, millions of things, all moving with coordinated purpose. Ships that had once belonged to other species now corrupted and repurposed. Organic constructs that might have been grown or assembled. Weapons that defied classification. Council observers watched from their station, maintaining strict neutrality even as they documented what they assumed would be humanity's final hours. Ambassador Khalith spent those 3 days in his quarters, unable to watch but unable to look away from the reports. He had sent a message to his homeworld, describing what he had seen of human preparation. They had replied with condolences and a recommendation that he evacuate before the fighting started. He had not evacuated. On the second day, something unexpected happened. The human fleet began launching what appeared to be satellites, thousands of small objects that spread throughout near-Earth space in a carefully calculated pattern. Council sensors could not determine their purpose, but their positioning suggested some kind of sensor network or perhaps communication relay. They were neither. On the third day, with the swarm less than 6 hours from Earth orbit, the human fleet received its final orders. There were no speeches, no dramatic declarations, just simple instructions transmitted to every vessel. Hold the line. At the 4-hour mark, the swarm entered weapons range and humanity got its first real look at what it faced. The leading edge of the swarm was composed of what looked like scout units, smaller vessels moving ahead of the main mass. They were each the size of a small city, and there were hundreds of them. All batteries, open fire, Davis ordered. The human fleet unleashed everything it had. Railgun rounds accelerated to incredible speeds, missiles with nuclear warheads, experimental beam weapons that had never been properly tested. The space between Earth and the swarm lit up like a deadly fireworks display. The results were immediate and discouraging. The swarm scouts absorbed the energy weapons without apparent damage. The nuclear missiles detonated harmlessly against some kind of shielding. The railgun rounds hit, but the damage they caused was negligible against the massive targets. Worse, where human weapons struck, the swarm seemed to swell, incorporating the energy and matter into itself. They're adapting, Okonkwo reported from her station. Each hit is less effective than the last. Then we move to Phase 2, Davis replied. Activate Prometheus. Throughout near-Earth space, those thousands of satellites humanity had launched suddenly came to life. But they were not satellites. They were containers, and each one held billions of the microscopic particles that humanity had spent weeks perfecting. The containers opened and the particles spread like an invisible fog throughout the space around Earth. The swarm scouts flew directly into the cloud, unaware of the danger. They treated the particles as debris, too small to be threats. That was their first mistake. The particles activated following programming that was part chemical, part biological, and part something humanity had invented in desperation. They swarmed the scout vessels, attaching to every surface, burrowing into every gap. And then they began to feed. On the Defiance's sensors, the crew watched as the lead scout vessels began to deteriorate, not from explosions or energy damage, but from something more fundamental. The particles were breaking them down at a molecular level. Too fast for the swarm's adaptation to counter. Too simple to be classified as technology that could be absorbed. For the first time in recorded history, the swarm stopped advancing. The leading edge of the massive organism paused, and across Council observation stations, alarms began to sound. The swarm never stopped. It consumed, it adapted, it moved forward. But now it had paused, and the reason was simple. It was wounded, and it was surprised. Ambassador Chen watched the tactical display from the war room, her expression carefully neutral even as her heart raced. Around her, the room had gone silent, everyone staring at the same impossible sight. The swarm had stopped. It was only temporary, she knew. They would adapt, overcome, continue. But for this moment, humanity had done something no other species had managed. They had made the swarm hesitate, and in that hesitation, something changed. It was not hope, not yet, but it was proof that the impossible was only impossible until someone was desperate enough to try it anyway. The swarm's hesitation lasted exactly 17 minutes. Then it adapted, and the real battle began. Commander Davis watched as the massive organism began to change. its forward elements developing what looked like energy shields that repelled the microscopic particles. But the adaptation was not perfect, and it had cost the swarm. 3 of the scout vessels had been completely destroyed, dissolved into component atoms by humanity's nanoweapon. It was not much, but it was more than any other species had achieved in their first engagement. "They're moving again," Lieutenant Park reported, main mass accelerating toward Earth orbit. "Launch the second wave," Davis ordered, his voice steady despite the fact that his hands were gripping the armrests hard enough to leave impressions. "All ships, execute Delta formation." The human fleet split into smaller groups, each one moving to a different position around Earth. It was not a defensive formation in the traditional sense. It was something that had been developed in the frantic weeks of preparation, based on tactics from naval warfare, aerial combat, guerrilla fighting, and a dozen other sources. The Council military advisors who had reviewed the plans had called them suicidal. They were probably right, but suicide runs only mattered if you expected to survive anyway. The swarm came on like a tsunami of impossible biology and stolen technology. The main mass was larger than some moons, a churning collection of consumed civilizations all repurposed into a single organism with one purpose: consume everything. Smaller elements broke off from the main body, heading toward the human fleet like antibodies attacking an infection. "Incoming targets, multiple vectors," Okonkwo announced, matching signature to Council database. "Those are converted Keltharian battleships." Davis felt his stomach turn. The Kelthari had been one of the advanced civilizations the swarm had consumed a century ago. Their ships had been legendary, weapons platforms capable of cracking planets. Now they served the enemy, twisted and changed but still deadly, and they were heading straight for the Defiance. All ships weapons-free, make every shot count. What followed was not warfare as the Council understood it. There were no elegant maneuvers or tactical doctrines executed with precision. It was chaos, desperate and violent and completely unpredictable. Human ships dove toward enemy vessels that outmassed them by factors of hundreds, firing everything they had, then breaking away in patterns that seemed random, but were actually calculated to make them impossible to predict. The Defiance targeted one of the converted battleships, releasing a spread of missiles that the enemy's point defense systems easily destroyed. But the missiles were not meant to hit. They were meant to distract. While the swarm vessel's attention was focused on the obvious threat, a dozen railgun rounds slammed into its hull from a different angle, punching through armor and destroying what looked like a critical power junction. The battleship shuddered but did not stop. Instead, it began to repair itself, organic material flowing like liquid metal to seal the breaches. But the repair took time and resources, and during that time it was vulnerable. "Target is regenerating," Park reported. "Estimate 30 seconds to full repair." "Then we have 30 seconds, Davis replied. "Okonkwo, execute Crazy Ivan." The maneuver was named after an old submarine tactic from Earth's naval history, adapted for space combat with modifications that would have made its inventors proud or horrified. The Defiance suddenly cut all power to its engines and began spinning, using maneuvering thrusters to create a chaotic tumble that made predicting its trajectory nearly impossible. To the swarm battleship, it looked like the human vessel had lost control. It adjusted its course to pursue, moving to consume the apparently disabled target. This was its second mistake. As the battleship closed, the Defiance suddenly fired a weapon it had been holding in reserve. It was not a missile or a railgun round or an energy beam. It was something humanity had called Project Scorpion, and it was completely insane. A modified mining laser, originally designed for cutting through asteroids, fired at point-blank range directly into the battleship's open wound, where the railgun rounds had struck. But the laser had been modified to pulse at a specific frequency that the swarm's matter conversion process could not easily adapt to. It was not elegant or efficient, but it worked. For 6 seconds, the laser burned through the battleship's interior, causing cascading failures in systems that had been stolen from a dozen different species. Then the enemy vessel's power core overloaded, and the battleship tore itself apart from within. "Kill confirmed," Okonkwo reported, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "But we've lost shield integrity. Hull breaches on decks 4 and 7. Around Earth orbit, similar engagements were playing out across 41 separate battlefields. Human ships were not winning in any traditional sense. They were being destroyed, torn apart by enemies they could barely damage. but they were making every death costly, taking down one enemy vessel for every 2 human ships lost. The mathematics still said humanity would lose, but the rate of loss was slower than anyone had predicted. On the surface, the ground defenses activated. Massive railgun installations built into mountains and ocean platforms opened fire, launching projectiles that crossed the boundary between atmosphere and space in seconds. They were one-shot weapons, each installation burning itself out with the force of its discharge. But they had been positioned across the entire planet. Hundreds of rounds tore through the swarm's forward elements, and while most were absorbed or deflected, some found their marks. In the war room beneath Geneva, Ambassador Chen watched the tactical displays with the cold calculation of someone who had already accepted the outcome and was now just fighting for the details. Human casualties were mounting. 6 ships destroyed, 3 more crippled. Ground installations were being systematically targeted and eliminated. The colony ships remained grounded, waiting for an opening that might never come, but the swarm was paying a price. The adapted Keltharian battleships had been reduced from 27 to 19. Scout vessels were still dissolving in the particle clouds that humanity kept releasing. The main mass had slowed its advance, becoming more cautious as it assessed this unexpected resistance. Transmission incoming from Council Station, an aide reported. Ambassador Khalith is requesting direct communication. Chen almost ignored it. She did not need alien condolences while her species fought for survival, but something made her accept the connection. Khalith's image appeared on a secondary screen, and Chen was surprised to see that the alien ambassador looked genuinely shaken. Ambassador Chen, he began without preamble, I am transmitting data to your military command. The Council has been observing your engagement with the swarm, and our analysts have identified a pattern in its adaptive responses. There may be a weakness you can exploit. Chen felt something cold settle in her chest. You said the Council would not intervene. We are not intervening, Khalith replied carefully. We are merely sharing information that you may use as you see fit. What you do with that information is your decision. It was a semantic distinction that fooled no one, but Chen did not care. Send the data. The transmission came through, and Chen forwarded it immediately to the fleet command. Within seconds, analysis confirmed what Khalith had suggested. The swarm was adapting to each weapon system it encountered, but the adaptations were specific. A ship adapted to railguns remained vulnerable to missiles. A ship adapted to particle weapons could still be damaged by conventional explosives. The swarm was powerful, but it was not infinitely adaptable. It had to choose what to defend against. Get this to every ship, Chen ordered, and tell them to coordinate their attacks. If we hit with multiple weapon types simultaneously, the swarm cannot adapt fast enough. Back in space, Commander Davis received the data and immediately understood its implications. It was not a miracle solution, but it was an edge, a way to make their weapons more effective. And at this point, every small advantage could mean the difference between quick extinction and buying a few more precious hours. All ships, new tactical protocol, he broadcast. Coordinate your weapon types. Force the enemy to choose what to defend against. Make them pay for every adaptation. The human fleet adjusted its tactics in real time, ships that had been fighting independently now working in concert. A vessel would attack with missiles, forcing the enemy to adapt. Then another would follow with railguns before the adaptation could complete. It was crude coordination compared to the elegant fleet actions of the Council races, but it was effective. The swarm's advance slowed further, not stopped, but definitely hindered. And in that bought time, humanity prepared its next desperate gambit. The battle had been raging for 18 hours and the human fleet was dying. 31 ships remained operational out of the original 41. Ammunition was running low. Power cores were operating at dangerous levels. And still the swarm came, an endless tide of stolen technology and biological horror that seemed to have no bottom to its reserves. Commander Davis stood on the bridge of the Defiance, his uniform torn and blood-stained from a hull breach that had killed 3 crew members before emergency bulkheads could seal. His ship was running on backup systems, main engines damaged beyond repair, but it was still fighting. They were all still fighting because the alternative was dying without purpose, and humans had never been good at accepting that. Status report, Davis called out, his voice hoarse from breathing recycled air thick with smoke. Hull integrity at 40%, Okonkwo reported from her station. Railgun ammunition depleted, missile reserves down to 6 units, main reactor cycling between 70 and 90% efficiency. We have maybe 2 hours of combat capability left. 2 hours. Davis looked at the tactical display showing the swarm's main mass, still massive despite the losses humanity had inflicted. 2 hours would not be enough. Nothing would be enough. But they had bought time, and that was something. "Commander, incoming transmission from Earth," Lieutenant Park said. "It's Ambassador Chen, Priority Alpha." Chen's face appeared on the screen, and Davis was struck by how exhausted she looked. The war room behind her showed signs of damage from a near miss by a swarm weapon that had penetrated the atmosphere. They were not just fighting in space anymore. The battle had come to Earth's doorstep. "Commander, we're implementing the final option," Chen said without preamble. "Operation Last Light. We need you to pull back to minimum safe distance." Davis felt his blood run cold. Operation Last Light was the contingency they had all hoped would never be necessary. It was humanity's final throw of the dice, the option that meant accepting there was no victory, only vengeance. "Ambassador, if we pull back, the swarm will advance unchecked. We're barely holding the line as it is." "I know," Chen replied, and her voice carried a weight that made Davis understand this decision had not been made lightly. "But we've run the calculations. You've bought us enough time. The colony ships are ready to launch, and they'll need every second you've given us. Last Light will create a window, maybe our only window, for them to escape." Davis wanted to argue, but he understood military necessity. The fleet had fought beyond all expectations, held longer than anyone thought possible, but they were at the end. Last Light was the final card humanity had to play. "Acknowledged," he said. "All ships will withdraw to safe distance. How long until activation?" 30 minutes. "Get clear, Commander. And thank you. Every single one of you." The transmission ended, and Davis took a breath before activating fleet communications. "All ships, this is Defiance Actual. We are executing Withdrawal Protocol Echo. Pull back to designated safe coordinates. Operation Last Light is go in 30 minutes. The responses came back, some acknowledgments professional and crisp, others ragged with exhaustion and grief. But they all complied. The human fleet began its withdrawal, using the last of their maneuvering fuel to pull back from the swarm's advance. The swarm, sensing the retreat, pressed forward with renewed aggression. It interpreted the withdrawal as victory, as prey finally breaking and running. In a way, it was right. But it had not learned the most important lesson about humanity. They were most dangerous when cornered. On Earth, in a bunker beneath what had once been the Australian outback, Dr. James Chen, no relation to the ambassador despite sharing a surname, watched his life's work prepare to activate. Before the crisis, he had been a theoretical physicist working on exotic matter and energy states. His research had been considered interesting but impractical, the kind of pure science that might have applications in a century or two. The swarm had changed that timeline considerably. Project Last Light was built around a principle so dangerous that the Galactic Council had banned even theoretical research into it. The weaponization of vacuum decay, a way to destabilize the quantum fields that made up reality itself. In theory, if you could create a bubble of lower energy state in the universe, it would expand at the speed of light, essentially rewriting the laws of physics in a wave of destruction that nothing could stop. In practice, creating such a weapon required energy levels that most species could not achieve, and a willingness to risk destroying not just a solar system, but potentially causing a chain reaction that could threaten a galaxy. It was the ultimate deterrent, and every civilization that had discovered the theory had wisely decided never to build it. Humanity, facing extinction, had built 3 of them. "Devices are armed," Dr. Chen reported to the war room. "Activation sequence requires your authorization, Ambassador." In Geneva, Ambassador Sarah Chen stared at the authorization panel. 3 buttons, 3 devices, 3 points around Earth that would activate simultaneously. The calculations said the effect would be localized, contained to the inner solar system. The calculations also admitted to a 5% margin of error, which in this case meant a 5% chance of ending reality as they knew it. But the swarm was here, and there were no other options. "Authorization code Phoenix Rising 77 Alpha," Chen spoke clearly. "All devices are authorized for activation." The countdown began. 30 minutes. Around Earth, the colony ships began their launch sequences. 47 vessels, each carrying 10,000 souls in cryogenic suspension. Less than 500,000 people out of billions, but it was something. It was survival. In space, Commander Davis and the remains of his fleet watched as the swarm continued its advance toward Earth. They were outside the estimated danger zone, but barely. If the calculations were wrong, they would die with everyone else. But that was acceptable. They had already accepted death the moment they volunteered for this mission. "Sir, sensors are detecting something," Park reported. "The swarm is accelerating. It's like they sense something is wrong." Davis checked the tactical display. She was right. The swarm's advance had become more aggressive, more urgent. Could it somehow detect the weapon being prepared? Or had it simply decided to end this irritating resistance once and for all? "Time to last light?" Davis asked. 15 minutes. "And time until swarm reaches Earth orbit?" 12 minutes. The room went silent. The swarm would reach Earth before the weapon could activate. That meant ground forces would be engaged, defensive installations would fire their last rounds, and millions of people in the evacuation zones would face the enemy directly. But it also meant the swarm would be exactly where humanity needed it to be. On Earth's surface, the last defensive batteries opened fire, not the massive railguns that had already been expended, but smaller weapons, conventional missiles and energy weapons that would barely scratch the swarm. But they did not need to cause damage. They needed to hold attention. The swarm's forward elements entered Earth's atmosphere, and for the first time, humanity saw the enemy in their sky. Massive organic constructs descended like diseased moons, blocking out the sun, reaching toward the surface with appendages that defied description. Where they touched the ocean, the water began to churn and convert. Where they touched land, vegetation withered and died as the swarm consumed everything. In cities around the world, people who had chosen to stay behind looked up at their doom. Some prayed, some cried, some stood defiant to the end. All of them were human, facing the end of their species with whatever courage they could muster. 5 minutes to last light, the countdown announced. The colony ships were still launching, racing to escape the atmosphere and reach minimum safe distance. 47 vessels climbing on pillars of fire, carrying humanity's future away from humanity's grave. Some would make it, some would not, but they were trying, and that was all anyone could ask. 2 minutes. The swarm's main mass entered Earth orbit, a presence so vast that it affected the planet's gravitational field. Sensors screamed warnings about tectonic instability, atmospheric disruption, and a dozen other ways the planet was beginning to die just from the enemy's proximity. 1 minute. Commander Davis gripped his armrests and thought about his daughter, safe aboard one of the colony ships. She would live. She would remember. She would tell stories about this day, about how humanity faced the impossible and refused to surrender. That would have to be enough. 30 seconds. On Earth, Ambassador Chen stood in the war room watching multiple screens showing different views of the planet. The swarm was everywhere now, a cancer consuming the world. But it had made a mistake. It had committed its full mass to the attack, believing humanity broken and defeated. 10 seconds. The countdown reached 0, and 3 devices hidden in bunkers around the world activated simultaneously. For a microsecond, nothing happened. Then reality screamed. 3 points in space suddenly changed, the quantum fields that made up the fabric of the universe dropping to a lower energy state. The effect expanded in perfect spheres moving at the speed of light, and where those spheres touched the swarm, the enemy simply ceased to exist, not destroyed or consumed or converted. The silence that followed the swarm's destruction was more profound than any sound. Commander Davis stood on the bridge of the Defiance, staring at sensors that showed nothing but empty space where moments before, an unstoppable enemy had been. His crew remained at their stations, hands frozen over controls, as if afraid that any movement might shatter whatever miracle had just occurred. "Confirm sensor readings," Davis finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Lieutenant Park worked her console with shaking hands. "Confirmed, sir. The swarm is gone. All mass readings negative. Energy signatures baseline. There's nothing out there except empty space and debris from our destroyed ships." It took another full minute for the reality to sink in. They had survived. Humanity had survived. What should have been their extinction had somehow become their victory. And none of them quite knew how to process that. "All ships, report status," Davis ordered, needing something concrete to focus on. The responses came back slowly, voices tight with emotion that military discipline could barely contain. 26 ships remained operational out of the original 41. 15 vessels and their crews had been lost, but the survivors were alive, and that fact seemed impossible. On Earth, the situation was more complicated. The swarm had touched the surface in 36 locations before last light activated. Those areas were devastated, the land poisoned by whatever process the swarm used to convert matter. Early estimates suggested 2 million casualties, people who had been in the wrong place when the enemy descended. But that number, as horrific as it was, represented less than 1% of 1% of humanity's population. 8 billion people should have died. Only 2 million had. The mathematics of survival had reversed. Ambassador Chen stood in the war room watching reports flow in from around the globe. Cities were damaged but standing. The atmosphere was contaminated in localized areas but breathable everywhere else. The planet's ecosystem had been wounded but not killed. They had paid a terrible price, but they had paid it and survived. Ambassador, we're receiving communications from the council station, an aide reported. Multiple council representatives are requesting immediate contact. Ambassador Khalith is first in queue. Chen almost laughed at the absurdity. The council that had written humanity off as doomed now wanted to talk. She considered making them wait, a petty revenge for their abandonment. But there were more important things to address. Put Khalith through. The alien ambassador's image appeared, and Chen was surprised to see something in his expression that looked almost like shame. Or perhaps that was just her interpretation filtered through exhaustion and relief. Ambassador Chen, Khalith began, and his voice carried a weight it had not held before. I must first offer my congratulations on your species' survival. What you accomplished today has never been done in recorded history. The swarm has been a plague on the galaxy for millennia, and you eliminated it in a single engagement. We had no choice, Chen replied flatly. You gave us 7 cycles to evacuate. We couldn't save everyone, so we saved no one by leaving. We fought because fighting was the only option that didn't feel like surrender. Khalith was silent for a moment. The council has been analyzing your battle tactics and the weapon you used to destroy the swarm. We need to understand what happened. That kind of reality manipulation is beyond anything in our database. It's beyond anything in ours too, Chen admitted. We built something that should have been impossible because impossible was all we had left. The theoretical research existed, but every species with the knowledge decided it was too dangerous to pursue. We pursued it anyway because extinction tends to change your perspective on acceptable risks. The council wishes to speak with you, Khalith said carefully. There are questions about what this means for humanity's place in the galactic community. You destroyed the swarm, but you also demonstrated weapons technology that exceeds anything in the known galaxy. There are concerns. Chen felt something cold settle in her stomach. Of course there were concerns. Humanity had just proven it was capable of rewriting reality when sufficiently motivated. That made them dangerous, unpredictable, and now impossible to dismiss as primitive newcomers. Tell the council we'll talk, Chen said. After we've buried our dead and saved our wounded. After we've dealt with the contaminated zones and reassured our people that the crisis is truly over. After we've done all of that, then we'll discuss politics. She ended the transmission before Khalith could respond. There would be time for diplomacy later. Right now, humanity needed to heal. In orbit, the colony ships were returning to Earth. 47 vessels that had been meant to carry humanity's remnants to new worlds were instead bringing back people who no longer needed to flee. Families would be reunited. Children would see their home planet again. It was not a perfect ending, but it was an ending that allowed for new beginnings. Commander Davis coordinated the recovery efforts, directing salvage operations for the destroyed ships and arranging medical evacuation for wounded crews. The Defiance was too damaged to enter atmosphere safely, but it could serve as a coordination hub. It felt appropriate somehow that his broken ship would help shepherd everyone home. Commander, we're receiving a transmission from one of the salvage teams, Okonkwo reported. They've found survivors in the wreckage of the Valiant. 17 crew members made it to an escape pod before the ship was destroyed. 17 more lives saved. Davis made a note to send a recovery team immediately. Every survivor mattered. Every life preserved was a testament to what they had fought for. Down on Earth, Dr. James Chen stood in the ruins of the bunker that had housed the last light device. The weapon had burned itself out in its single use, leaving nothing but melted metal and vitrified rock. There would be no studying it, no reverse engineering to understand exactly what they had done. In a way, that was probably for the best. You realize we got lucky, his assistant, Dr. Sarah Kim, said beside him. The 5% chance of catastrophic failure was optimistic. We could have ended reality. I know, Chen replied, but we didn't. And now no one will ever build one of these again because we've proven it works and shown exactly what happens when you use it. No sane species would risk it. We risked it. We weren't sane. We were desperate. He looked up at the sky where the stars were just becoming visible in the evening light. Maybe that's humanity's role in the galaxy. To be the ones willing to do the insane thing when everything else has failed. The recovery efforts continued for weeks. The contaminated zones were contained, though it would take decades before those areas could support life again. The 2 million casualties were mourned in ceremonies around the world, their names recorded in monuments that would stand for generations. They had not fought, most of them, but they had died in humanity's victory, and they would be remembered as such. The damaged ships were either repaired or stripped for parts. The Defiance was too far gone to save, but its name would live on. Plans were already being drawn for a new flagship that would carry the same designation. It seemed fitting that humanity's Defiance would become a legacy rather than just a ship. Ambassador Keyleth visited Earth 3 weeks after the battle, arriving on a shuttle that landed at the rebuilt Geneva spaceport. Chen met him there personally, and they walked together through the city that was already showing signs of recovery. Humans had a remarkable ability to rebuild, to take devastation and transform it into renewal. I have been authorized to extend an official invitation, Keyleth said as they walked. The Council wishes to offer humanity full membership, not probationary status. You would have full voting rights and representation in all matters. Because we proved we're dangerous? Chen asked. Because you proved you're survivors, Keyleth corrected. The galaxy needs survivors. The swarm was not the only threat out there, merely the most immediate. There are other dangers, other challenges that will require the kind of innovative thinking humanity demonstrated. Chen considered this. Full Council membership had been humanity's goal when they first made contact, but that had been before the crisis, before they learned that the galaxy would watch them die rather than risk helping. The offer meant something different now. We'll accept, she said finally, but on our terms. We're not joining as junior partners or as curiosities. We're joining as equals who saved themselves when everyone else thought we were doomed. I would expect nothing less, Keyleth replied, and there might have been the alien equivalent of a smile in his expression. They walked in silence for a while longer, watching the city rebuild itself around them. Humanity had faced extinction and emerged stronger. They had proven that the impossible was simply the improbable that no one had tried hard enough to achieve. And most importantly, they had shown that sometimes the newest species, the ones everyone underestimated, could teach the oldest lessons about survival. 5 years after the battle that should have ended humanity, Ambassador Sarah Chen stood before the Galactic Council as the official representative of Earth and all its colonies. The chamber was vast, designed to accommodate thousands of species from across the known galaxy, each with their own unique biology and cultural requirements. Chen stood in the section designated for carbon-based oxygen breathers, wearing a formal suit that represented no nation but all of humanity. Today was the day humanity would present its proposal, and the galaxy would learn that surviving the swarm had only been the beginning. The Council recognizes Ambassador Chen of humanity, the speaker announced. Its voice translated into thousands of languages simultaneously. You have requested time to address the full assembly. The floor is yours. Chen stepped forward and holographic displays throughout the chamber focused on her. Billions of beings across the galaxy were watching this moment, waiting to see what the species that defeated the impossible would say now that they had recovered. 5 years ago, the swarm came to Earth, Chen began, her voice steady and clear. You told us we were doomed. You gave us time to evacuate, offered sympathy, and prepared to witness our extinction. You did this not out of cruelty but out of mathematics. The swarm had never been defeated. Fighting it was not just difficult, it was impossible according to every model, every simulation, every historical precedent. She paused, letting the words settle. Around the chamber, representatives from species that had made those very calculations shifted uncomfortably. We fought anyway, Chen continued. Not because we were smarter or stronger or more advanced than the species that came before us. We fought because we did not understand that we were supposed to lose. We were too young, too inexperienced, too desperate to know that what we were attempting could not be done. Holographic displays showed images from the battle, human ships crewed and patched together facing the swarm's impossible mass, the deployment of weapons that should not have worked, the final activation of last light and the swarm's erasure from reality. In the aftermath, you offered us membership in this council. You recognized our strength and invited us to join you as equals. We accepted, grateful for the opportunity to learn from species with thousands of years of experience and wisdom. And for 5 years we have learned. We have studied your histories, your technologies, your cultures. We have been good students. Chen's expression hardened slightly, but we have also been watching. And we have seen something that troubles us deeply. The galaxy is dying slowly and quietly, and you are all so accustomed to it that you no longer notice. A murmur ran through the chamber. The speaker raised an appendage for silence. Please explain this accusation, Ambassador. It is not an accusation, Chen replied. It is an observation. In the past 1,000 years, the Galactic Council has not expanded its borders. No new technologies have been developed that fundamentally change how you operate. No major challenges have been overcome. You maintain what you have, preserve what exists, but you do not grow. You have become so focused on stability that you have forgotten how to evolve. She activated another display, this one showing a map of the galaxy with highlighted regions. There are 17 sectors that were abandoned after the swarm attacks. Dozens of worlds rendered uninhabitable by various disasters. Hundreds of species that went extinct not because they were defeated, but because they never tried to fight. The Council's response to every crisis is the same. Calculate the cost. Determine if intervention is worth the risk, and if the mathematics say no, offer sympathy and watch as another civilization falls. The chamber erupted in protests and arguments. Some species defended the Council's approach, citing the need for rational decision-making. Others seemed uncomfortable, as if Chen had voiced doubts they had long suppressed. Order, the speaker demanded. Ambassador Chen, are you suggesting the Council abandon its principles of calculated risk assessment? I am suggesting, Chen said clearly, that your calculations are incomplete. You factor in resources, casualties, probability of success, but you do not factor in what is gained by attempting the impossible. Humanity should have died. The mathematics said so, but we tried anyway. And in trying, we discovered things about reality that your civilization with 10,000 years of advancement had never found. We were forced to innovate in ways you never needed to because you always had the option of retreat. She walked to the center of the chamber, where her holographic image would be visible to every representative. I am proposing the formation of a new council initiative. We are calling it the Frontier Project. Its purpose is to take on challenges that the traditional cost-benefit analysis says are not worth the risk. To reclaim the abandoned sectors, to attempt the rescue missions declared mathematically unfeasible, to explore the regions of space considered too dangerous to enter. This is madness, one of the older council members declared. You are proposing that we waste resources on ventures with high probability of failure. I am proposing that we stop letting fear of failure prevent us from trying, Chen countered. Humanity will lead this initiative. We are volunteering our ships, our people, our resources. We are not asking anyone to join us, but we are inviting anyone who wants to remember what it feels like to push boundaries instead of accepting them. The speaker was silent for a long moment. This is unprecedented. The council must deliberate on such a proposal. Deliberate all you want, Chen said. We are going forward regardless of your decision. The question is whether you want to be part of it, or whether you want to watch from the sidelines like you watched us face the swarm. The session ended in chaos, representatives arguing among themselves about the proposal. But Chen had made her point. Humanity was not content to simply join the established order. They were going to change it. In the weeks that followed, the response was mixed. Some species rejected the Frontier Project as reckless and dangerous. They had spent millennia building stable civilizations, and they saw no reason to risk that stability for uncertain gains. Chen respected their decision. Stability had value, and not every species needed to be pioneers, but others responded differently. Young species recently inducted into the Council saw in humanity's proposal an echo of their own frustrated ambitions. Older species, those who remembered when they too had been explorers and innovators, felt something stir that had been dormant for centuries. And scattered individuals from dozens of civilizations, People who had never quite fit into their society's careful calculations volunteered for this mad human endeavor. Commander Davis, now promoted to admiral and given command of humanity's expanding fleet, reviewed the volunteer roster with a mixture of pride and concern. They had over 200 ships committed to the Frontier Project, and only half of them were human vessels. The rest came from 27 different species, each bringing their own technologies and perspectives. "We are either going to do something amazing," his second-in-command, now Captain Okonkwo, observed, "or we are going to fail spectacularly and prove the Council right about why no one should attempt the impossible." "Probably both," Davis replied with a grin. "Usually happens at the same time with humanity." The first Frontier Project mission launched 6 months after Chen's speech. The target was a system in the Keltharian sector, abandoned after the swarm attack that had consumed that civilization a century ago. Council analysis said the system was too contaminated to reclaim, the cost of cleanup exceeding any possible benefit. It would take 500 years for natural processes to render the worlds habitable again. The Frontier Project team arrived and immediately began implementing a solution that the Council had never considered because it seemed too risky. They deployed modified versions of the nanoparticles humanity had used against the swarm, but engineered to consume contamination instead of enemy vessels. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and violated 6 different safety protocols. It also worked. Within 3 years, the first Keltharian world was habitable again. Not pristine, not perfect, but livable. Good enough for colonization, good enough for a new beginning. The success attracted attention. More species began volunteering for the Frontier Project. More systems were targeted for reclamation. The mathematical models said most of these efforts would fail, but the actual success rate was hovering around 40%. Not good odds by Council standards, but infinitely better than the 0% success rate of not trying at all. 10 years after the battle with the swarm, Ambassador Chen stood in the reclaimed Keltharian system, watching as the first colonists, a mix of species including descendants of Keltharian survivors, began establishing settlements on a world that had been declared lost. Ambassador Kelleth stood beside her, having become an unlikely ally in humanity's efforts to wake up the galaxy. "You have changed things," Kelleth observed. "The Council is not the same institution it was before humanity arrived. Some say you have corrupted our careful wisdom. Others say you have reminded us of principles we had forgotten. What do you say?" Chen asked. "Kalithwa?"